Georgia wide receiver Ladd McConkey is a better real-life receiver than a dynasty asset. We will explain why on this episode of Locked On Dynasty Football Podcast.
You are Locked On Dynasty Football, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Here are your hosts, Marcus Mosher and Kate Madjuk.
Welcome back to the Locked On Dynasty Football Podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. We'd like to thank you for making us your first listen of the day. Today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. I am your host, Marcus Mosher. You can follow me on Twitter at Marcus_Mosher. Joining me today, as always, is Kate Madjuk. You can follow her on Twitter at Kate Madjuk. You can also read her at Pro Football Focus and Behind the Steel Curtain. On today's show, we are doing our rookie profile on Georgia wide receiver Ladd McConkey. And Kate, I got to be honest with you. I know I say this every episode, but he is legitimately one of my favorite players in this class to watch. I was even telling you pre-show, get a little tear on my eye when I talk about Ladd because he's just so much fun to discuss. So I want to know, what did you see from Ladd when you watched him on tape?
I really like him. And I'm going to be honest, Marcus, this is giving me reminiscent feelings of the way that we talked about Tank Dell last year. And the way that obviously Tank Dell much more had the production profile coming out of Houston. So that is not the comp, but the sort of route running, the finesse as a real wide receiver. But looking at the size, you have these points of hesitancy about whether or not he can be a true NFL wide receiver that translates to fantasy. And then boom, Tank Dell comes out, rookie season, absolutely dominates. Unfortunately has that season-ending injury, but by all accounts, totally defied expectations. And I don't know. I do think that Ladd McConkey, let's just talk about, kind of the basics here. Coming out of Georgia, never had a overly dominant season. And unfortunately, I think maybe this could have been the year, but started out the year, this 2023 season, missing 4 games with a back injury, ended up dealing with an ankle injury late in the season. So it just never came to fruition. He's a little smaller, under 6 foot, just under 6 foot, 186 pounds, so a slighter frame. Still he, has some muscle on him, but where he really wins is not with size at all. It's with his finesse as a route runner. Just such a crisp route runner, good footwork, just can completely spin a defensive back on their tails with the way that he runs routes.
Yeah, I want to address some of the stat production stuff. So a couple things. Number one, we just really don't see Georgia wide receivers put up big numbers. George Pickens never had 1,000-yard season at Georgia. Even if you go back to AJ Green, never had 1,000-yard season in Athens. So that's not a big deal. And a lot of it's because Georgia just has a very balanced offense. And actually, it's not even really balanced. It's just a lot of running because they're up in so many games. And Ladd McConkey played his entire career with Brock Bowers, who was the focal point of this offense. And longtime listeners know how I feel about Brock Bowers. So he was really the number 2 weapon on a pass offense that just doesn't throw the ball very often. So most of the time I get concerned if a wide receiver prospect doesn't have elite stats. I understand why McConkey doesn't, because it's just a trend at Georgia. But Kate, let's talk about his strengths and weaknesses, because to me, they're very well defined. And it doesn't take much. I'm not some kind of draft expert here to tell you that he's a fantastic route runner. If you watched him at the Senior Bowl, I mean, he just cooked every single cornerback that he went against.
Hey, Marcus, who else cooked at the Senior Bowl and just made every defensive back look silly? Little guy named Tank Dell.
Yeah, absolutely. Can run routes on the outside, can run from the slot. It doesn't really matter. You can run any single route with him, and he's fantastic. Excellent speed. He ran in the 4.3s at the NFL Combine. Now, I will say, if you watched him during the 2022 season, I think you saw that speed on display more than you did in 2023 because he was dealing with all the injuries. In 2022, he was flying, absolutely flying. And I know if you're watching with us on YouTube, you don't see the agility numbers because he didn't do them at the combine, because that entire wide receiver group decided to opt out against them. He did them at Georgia's pro day. Both the 3-cone and the 20-yard shuttle were both like in the 95th percentile. Like, this is a fast but quick receiver, and you see it on tape. I really like how he can play all the different positions. It's one of the things that I like about him so much. And I think if you want somebody who's going to get open in the short to intermediate parts of the field, I'm not so sure there's any receiver in this class that I trust more outside of like Roma Dunze to run the right route at the right depth and get open on every single route.
There's just something to be said. Like, it's not necessarily he's a good athlete, but it's not just the athleticism where he wins. He really is kind of a route technician. Like, everything feels so precise. I think a lot of teams are going to like him for that fact. And again, like, looking at the kind of trajectory, I do think he was on pace and had some opportunity if he was healthy to really showcase that on full display. But again, like, between the back injury, between the lower body injury, like that, it just never came to fruition for McConkey. Now, let's talk about some of the weaknesses. Obviously, one of those weaknesses, it's going to be size, and that does sometimes translate to a lack of play strength.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you can see it like when you watch the Alabama game. Kool-Aid McKinstry and Terrion Arnold just bullied him. And that's my biggest fear is like some of these cornerbacks that are a little bit more experienced that like to play up in your face. I mean, there was one rep where Terrion Arnold like jammed him at the line of scrimmage, Kate, and just took him to the sideline. Like, that's, I really worry about like how strong he can play against some bigger, more physical DBs. And then the other thing it's not a concern, but it's at least worth noting. So again, he ran a 4.38 or 4.39, the official time at the NFL Combine. And you see that on the field, but it's not necessarily as a deep threat. I don't think he's somebody that you're going to be throwing go routes to down the field. Now, that doesn't mean he can't do it, but that's not his primary skill set, right? Like, where he's going to use his speed is in the route running to create separation. So don't think he's the next Tank Dell down the field or Tyreek Hill or anything like that, because that's just not really his game. Think of him as a more souped up slot receiver than we are used to seeing.
I think all of that is very fair, but like, souped up slot receiver, I do think McConkey also, has some ability to play outside despite maybe,
Yes.
some of that lack of play strength. If he's a team's wide receiver too, like you mentioned, he can play all of the wide receiver positions, but I do think, like, if he's not asked to necessarily be the one in an offense, put him outside, because he is going to be able to win in just because of that nuanced route running in a way that, it gives whatever respective offense some flexibility. And you don't necessarily have to put him in the slot, though he's going to be a great mismatch against opposing linebackers with the way he's able to manipulate and with the footwork and all of the things that make him such a fantastic route runner.
All right, let's dive into some of the analytics with Ladd McConkey, because they're very up and down depending on the numbers that you value and the ones that you don't. Like, if you really value production, McConkey's not your guy, but there are other things that are really exciting. We will dive into that next. This episode is brought to you by Robinhood. Did you know that even if you have a 401k for retirement, you can still have an IRA? Robinhood has the only IRA that gives you a 3% boost on every dollar that you contribute when you subscribe to Robinhood Gold. But get this, now through April 30th, Robinhood is even boosting every single dollar that you transfer in from other retirement accounts with a 3% match. That's right, no cap on the 3% match. Robinhood Gold gets you the most for your retirement thanks to their IRA with a 3% match. This offer is good through April 30th. Get started at robinhood.com/boost. Subscription fees apply. And now for some legal info. Claim as of Q1 2024, validated by Radius Global Market Research. Investing involves risk, including loss. Limitations apply to IRAs and 401ks. 3% match requires Robinhood Gold from 1 year from the date of your first 3% match. Must keep Robinhood IRA for 5 years. The 3% matching on transfers is subject to specific terms and conditions. Robinhood IRA available to U.S. customers in good standing. Robinhood Financial LLC, member SIPC, is a registered broker-dealer. Welcome back to the Locked On Dynasty Football Podcast. We wanted to let you know about Locked On Sports today. Are you watching Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day? Are you having to turn down the volume because of all that shouting? Make the switch to Locked On Sports today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel program for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all that unnecessary screaming. Locked On Sports today brings you the can't miss analysis, opinions, and news of the day, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or on the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. All right, Kate, let's dive into some of the advanced numbers of Ladd McConkey. And I got to be honest, like these are some of my favorite talking points that we do every week when we come to some of these receivers, because you can really get a good idea from the numbers of what this player could be in the NFL. So what do we got for Ladd?
You have, depending, like you said earlier, a lot of ups and downs depending on what you value. Now, first, let's look at the more efficiency-based metrics. So 82nd percentile in PFF receiving grade, 90th percentile in separation percentage, which obviously speaks tremendous loads to his ability as a route runner. What people might find surprising, 75th percentile for contested catch percentage, which I think, based on general play strength, when you're watching Ladd McConkey, comes up a little bit surprising. But across the board, 50th plus percentile yards per route run, yards after the catch per reception, like very well-rounded in terms of his efficiency metrics. But again, obviously where you're going to have some of these struggles is the production profile. He never truly had any breakout season. Like the production profile just wasn't there, and coulda, shoulda, woulda in terms of his health in the 2023 season, but we'll never know what he might have done. But because of that lack of a breakout, because of that lack of taking over the offense, which you mentioned earlier in the show, like nobody really ever does necessarily in a Georgia offense, but 19th percentile for college dominator rating, 27th percentile in terms of college target share, was playing behind Brock Bowers, who, functioned as the leading receiver there in that offense. But I think like you can go up in the air about the target percentage, etc. But I think when Ladd McConkey is on the football field, the advanced metrics speak for themselves.
I want to talk a little bit about some advanced metrics if you use the 2022 and 2023 seasons combined, because what I saw in 2022 was just a way more explosive player. And I think that when you watch him on tape, you can understand why that was, because of the injuries. But if you combine those two seasons, according to PFF, 97th percentile receiving grade versus zone coverage. Like he is going to crush it in the NFL against zone. 93rd percentile separation percentage, 83rd percentile separation percentage versus single coverage. And then the yards per route run, ADOT and YAC were all above the 55th percentile. He just checks a lot of boxes, Kate, whether it's, most of the advanced numbers being really good, the athleticism being really good, runs in the 4.3s, the agilities are off the chart. And what makes him even different from like, we're going to talk about like Hunter Renfrow, like, cause that's a very common comp, is he's significantly bigger than a Hunter Renfrow, right? He's a couple inches taller. He's about 10 pounds heavier. And you see that on tape. Like he is not a small receiver. He's just not a big one either. So for me, he just checks a lot of the boxes when you're looking at, okay, what does a top 50 wide receiver in the NFL draft look like? And to me, he is.
Yeah, I don't really think there's any question there. I think the biggest question that anybody is going to have about Ladd McConkey is definitely regarding how much that success that we can project on the football field is actually going to project into fantasy points. He's kind of this enigma, and I do think the lack of production profile is a huge part of that about it, projecting like how much is he actually going to produce fantasy points. And maybe that is really dependent on landing spot and scheme, like as
Well,
opposed.
let's talk about that right now because I think that's how we let off the show. I think he projects as a better NFL player than a dynasty asset because I think he's going to be used a lot like underneath and as a zone beater and as a third down receiver. I'm not so sure that he's going to be like a big touchdown player. Maybe he is, and I could be completely wrong. And I also don't see him being a deep threat. So his value is going to come almost exclusively from catches, right? Like in targets.
PPR machine.
PPR machine. But at the same time, you need to be with a quarterback that's willing to pepper that receiver with targets. And that's where the landing spot matters a lot to me. Yesterday, we talked about Stephon Diggs being traded from the Bills to the Texans. Before that move even happened, I thought Ladd made a lot of sense in Buffalo as a potential replacement for Diggs, right? Like somebody who can play on the outside and in the slot that gets open quickly so Josh Allen can deliver him the ball. Remember, a lot of Diggs's production wasn't down the field stuff. It was all like within 10, 12 yards to the line of scrimmage. I think Ladd in Buffalo could actually have a lot of dynasty value. My concern is he's going to go somewhere like San Francisco or Detroit or Kansas City and be like locked in as the third receiver and be a very good third receiver, but not have any dynasty value.
I think those are all pretty fair concerns. Now, where he's projected to go, he is projected, to go late first round, some landing spots, like you mentioned. I think there's a lot of places here where, based on the projection for late first round, yeah, less than ideal because a lot of these places are already a little bit jam packed when it comes to the receiver room. You look at picks 24 onward, we've got the Dallas Cowboys, Green Bay Packers, Tampa Bay Buccaneers, Arizona Cardinals, who most are mocking to get Marvin Harrison Jr. Buffalo Bills at 28 makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
But then you've got Detroit, Baltimore, San Francisco, and Kansas City. And yeah, those landing spots aren't necessarily those places where he's going to be peppered with targets, though I think that that's the role that he would most likely succeed in at the highest level in the NFL.
I'm going to give you some other ones, other teams that I do think could increase his dynasty value. Buffalo, obviously, being number one. I think New England at 34. Let's imagine.
Oh, Marcus.
Well, listen, let's imagine they draft Drake May with the number 3 pick,
Okay.
and it's Ladd McConkey as the second pick in the second round. He would instantly be the best receiver, and I actually trust that Drake May can get him the ball quickly and accurately. I think that's a perfect landing spot for him.
I think that's fair. I'm actually not going to fight back with it. Definitely depends on what they do at quarterback. Like I'm kind of there's been even some conjecture that like what if they take Marvin Harrison Jr. He can't catch any balls if there's no quarterback to throw him the ball. Like I like the move of getting that, quarterback in the top 3 and then utilizing that pick, because I do think, again, Ladd McConkey is a wide receiver that isn't necessarily going to be the top receiver in a lot of offenses, but it's a role that I think he's capable of if you have the right supporting cast.
I'll give you another one, Kate. What about the Chargers at 37?
Very interesting. You could have Quentin Johnston on the outside doing God knows what, not
or
separating, or on the bench. Yeah, we could get Ladd McConkey maybe opposite Josh Palmer. You get a little bit of that quickness from Ladd McConkey that you're not necessarily going to get the same type of finesse out of Josh. I like that. You throw him with a quarterback like Justin Herbert and okay.
Here's my fear. Here's why, if I had to bet on what I think is going to happen, I think he goes like 43 to the Falcons and he stays in Georgia. And Kirk Cousins is like, hey, this is perfect, right? I get my underneath receiver. I have Drake London. I have Kyle Pitts. I've got Mooney stretching the field. McConkey can be the third receiver. He can be the slot receiver. And while like I think he'd be awesome on that team, and that's a great role for him, it just kind of nukes his dynasty value.
Yeah, he's a guy that probably out of all of the players that we like, we've talked about several players that I think are going to have a lot of dynasty fluctuation in terms of their perceived value. But like McConkey's production profile, I think will definitely fluctuate
Yes.
significantly based on landing spot. But that's not to say that there aren't some potential good fits out there.
Absolutely. All right, let's give some player comps for Ladd McConkey and discuss what his current dynasty value is. Just 4 weeks away from the NFL draft. We will get to that next. This episode is brought to you by Gametime. Gametime is now the authorized ticket marketplace of Major League Baseball, which makes getting tickets even faster and easier. Prices on the Gametime app actually go down the closer you get to the first pitch, with killer last minute deals, all in prices, views from your seat, and their best price guarantee. Gametime takes the guesswork out of buying MLB tickets. I love the last minute deals. You can save up to 60% off buying last minute for sports, concerts, comedy, theater, and more. Plus, you can save even more with exclusive in app deals on select seats ahead of the game or the event. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account, redeem promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download the Game Time app today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. This episode is brought to you by eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience. It's what brings home that winning formula. It's also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance, from superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has got you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber and not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit only available to U.S. customers. Welcome back to the Locked On Dynasty Football Podcast. We are discussing Georgia wide receiver Ladd McConkey in his dynasty value. Kate, where is he currently being drafted among rookie receivers and then among all receivers right now?
Right now on Fantasy Pros consensus dynasty rookie wide receiver rankings among the top experts, Ladd McConkey is coming in at wide receiver 7. So that is behind the big top 3: Marvin Harrison Jr., Malik Neighbors, Rome Odunze. Then you have the next tier, Brian Thomas Jr., who very widely consensus wide receiver 4, Troy Franklin, who we're actually going to talk about on tomorrow's show. So definitely check back for that. Xavier Worthy. And then we have Ladd McConkey, who's just ahead of A.D. Mitchell, Keon Coleman, and Roman Wilson. I think this is a pretty fair spot for Ladd McConkey. Like, Troy Franklin, I'm not a huge fan of, but has the production profile that you're looking, for. I think from that analytics community, I think Ladd McConkey's tape overall a lot cleaner for me, and a lot more consistent. Ladd McConkey's a much better route runner. Definitely going to translate, I think, to a much better NFL receiver. But when I'm looking at McConkey in comparison to some of these other players, I can understand why a lot of the circumstance might lead to maybe a lower ceiling overall for fantasy football.
Yeah, I think this is fair. I probably would have him below A.D. Mitchell, but also ahead of Troy Franklin, who, again, we will talk about tomorrow. So I don't want to give away too many of my thoughts there. But I think right around between wide receiver 6 and wide receiver 8 feels about right. I'm just not that high on him as a dynasty receiver because I think, or as of right now, like going into the draft, because I'm worried that he's going to be miscast as a slot receiver only and not as somebody who can move all around the field and that can be the center point of an offense. I think he can be on the right team. I'm just not sure the NFL views him that way. I think the draft will be pretty telling. So I'm willing to kind of just hold off until we see his landing spot. But when you watched his tape, Kate, was there any comparisons that came to mind? Because for me, it was Emmanuel Sanders as somebody who can play outside, inside, uses quickness, uses speed. Anybody that you saw?
We talked about this guy earlier in the show, and it's definitely got to be Hunter Renfrow for me, who I mean, probably one of the more underrated wide receivers in the NFL, one of the more underrated route runners in the NFL. Just the way that he can put defenders on their booties, like, and a couple of twitchy movements here from Ladd McConkey, and the defenders lost. And that's a trait that I always think of Hunter Renfrow when I think of like that more compact wide receiver with really precise route running who like wins in that way versus, necessarily like, you know, the physicality component like that is always going to bring me back to Hunter Renfrow. And I think honestly, Hunter Renfrow in his career trajectory, probably the type of floor that you would see from Ladd McConkey, though I think McConkey might have a higher NFL ceiling based on draft capital and especially dependent on landing spot.
I agree. We got to remember, though, we did see Hunter Renfrow have a 100 catch, 1,000-yard season.
He did.
It's kind of the focal point of that Raiders offense that went to the playoffs. Was it back in 2021, I believe? So I think there'll be some people that hear the Hunter Renfrow name and will think that's like a knock, like, oh, he's just Hunter Renfrow.
No,
No,
it's the highest compliment.
yeah, I think a healthy Hunter Renfrow is a very, very good player. That's a Pro Bowl receiver in 2021. The concussions had a lot to do with his kind of fall off and why he still doesn't have a team right now. But I actually think he can just be a little bit more dynamic than that because he's got he's got quite a bit more speed and a little bit more size. I do think he's somebody who has the flexibility and the versatility to be used all around the field. And I think he's closer to the Emmanuel Sanders types and the Hunter Renfrow, but I can see how Hunter Renfrow is a very solid floor. So I get it. I completely understand.
Yeah, I think all in all, we really like Ladd McConkey. I'm going to be very closely watching his landing spot on draft day because I think, again, this is going to be one of those players that I think a lot of NFL teams are going to really, really like. A lot of teams are going to want that diverse skill set and what he brings to the table. It's just a matter of, is he going to have the opportunity to become that PPR machine at the next level? Because I think he can handle it.
Yep.
We just got to get him that role.
We got to get him with the right quarterback. Get him a quarterback that can quickly get him the ball accurately and let him make plays after the catch because we saw at Georgia, he did that very, very well. That is it for today's show. We want to thank you for making Locked On Dynasty Football your first listen of the day. Go check out the channel on YouTube. We post videos every single day over there. Go download the podcast wherever you get your podcasts. We are free and available on all platforms. Go follow Kate on Twitter at Kate Majuk. I'm at Marcus_Mosher. And we will see you right back here tomorrow discussing Oregon wide receiver Troy Franklin.